My name is Eliyahu ben Ami. I am 47 years old, born and raised in Jerusalem, Israel. For most of my life, I believed I understood who I was and where I belonged. I was a Jewish man, the son of Jewish parents, the grandson of Holocaust survivors. My identity was woven deeply into tradition, history, and responsibility. From the outside, my life looked stable, even blessed. But inside, there was a quiet restlessness I never spoke about. Every morning, I followed the same routine. I woke before sunrise, washed my hands according to tradition, whispered prayers I had memorized as a child, and prepared for another long day. I worked as a civil engineer, overseeing infrastructure projects around Jerusalem. It was honest work, logical work, numbers, measurements, plans, things that made sense. Faith, however, no longer felt that simple. I believed in God. At least I believed in the idea of God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God my father spoke of with certainty and reverence. But somewhere along the years, between responsibilities and disappointments, my prayers had become mechanical. I prayed because I was supposed to. I believed because it was expected. Yet, late at night, when the city grew quiet and the call of daily obligations faded, questions would rise like an ache in my chest. Is God close or distant? Does he still speak to humanity? Is there more that we're not seeing or not allowed to see? I never dared to say these thoughts out loud. In my community, doubt was something you wrestled with alone. To question too much was to risk being misunderstood, or worse, judged. At home, I was a husband and a father of two. My wife, Miriam, was strong, practical, and deeply rooted in her faith. She found comfort in certainty. Our children looked to me as an example, a steady presence, a provider, a man who had answers. But the truth was, I felt like a man pretending to be whole. Some nights, I would sit on the balcony, looking at the ancient stones of Jerusalem, glowing under the moonlight. This city had witnessed prophets, wars, miracles, and silence. I wondered if God still moved among people, or if those days were long gone. Jesus was never part of my spiritual vocabulary. He was a historical figure at best, a controversial name at worst, someone associated with another faith, another story, another people. I never hated him. I simply dismissed him. He was not for us, or so I believed. Still, something inside me felt unfinished. There was a hunger I couldn't name, a sense that the world was standing on the edge of something fragile, something imminent. News headlines spoke of wars, division, fear, moral confusion. People were angrier, colder, more lost. Even Jerusalem, the city of God, felt heavy. I often asked myself, if God wanted to warn us, would we even listen? I didn't know that this question would soon be answered, not in words, not in theory, but in an experience that would tear my understanding of reality apart. I didn't know that my life, as I knew it, was already approaching its final ordinary day. And I certainly didn't know that January 2026 had already been marked, not by men, not by governments, but by heaven itself. As you read this first chapter, ask yourself, have you ever lived a normal life while quietly feeling that something was missing? Write in the comments. Have you ever questioned God in silence? Family, faith, and the weight of inherited belief. Faith in my family was not just belief, it was inheritance. My father used to say, "We don't believe because it feels good. We believe because we survived." Those words shaped my childhood. He was a quiet man, disciplined, shaped by stories of loss that were never fully told. My grandparents had survived horrors no human being should ever witness. For them, faith was not emotional. It was defiance. To remain Jewish was to declare that evil had not won. Growing up, I absorbed that message deeply. I learned the prayers, the laws, the rhythms of holy days and fasting. Faith was structure, faith was identity, faith was continuity. But no one taught me how to deal with doubt. As an adult, that unspoken rule followed me everywhere, especially inside my own home. Miriam, my wife, had a simple, unwavering faith. She didn't analyze God, she trusted Him. When life was difficult, she prayed harder. When things went well, she gave thanks. Watching her sometimes comforted me, and sometimes made me feel like a fraud. She believed I was spiritually strong. My children believed I was certain. But certainty was something I no longer possessed. At family dinners, conversations often turned toward the state of the world. Rising hatred, wars inching closer, a sense that humanity was losing its moral compass. My father would shake his head and say, "These are dangerous times. Messiah will come only when the world breaks." Those words lingered in my mind. What if the world was breaking? At work, I saw it differently, but just as clearly. Corruption, dishonesty, shortcuts that endangered lives, all justified by money and pressure. People no longer asked what was right, only what was profitable. Something sacred had been replaced by something cold. At night, when everyone slept, I would sometimes open the Tanakh and read familiar passages, hoping they would speak to me like they once did. But the words felt distant, like echoes from another era. I wasn't angry at God, I was confused by Him. I asked questions I never voiced. Why does God feel silent when the world is screaming? Why do the righteous suffer while cruelty thrives? If truth exists, why are we so divided? Still, I never imagined that answers could come outside the boundaries I had drawn in my mind. Jesus was still a name I avoided, not out of hatred, but loyalty. Loyalty to tradition, loyalty to history, loyalty to my ancestors' suffering. To consider Him seriously felt like betrayal. And yet I felt a strange pull toward the idea that God might be bigger than the boxes we place around Him. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. God was already preparing my heart, not through certainty, but through discomfort. Because when faith becomes routine, it often takes a rupture to awaken it. And that rupture was closer than I could ever imagine. Let me ask you something deeply personal. Have you ever felt pressured to believe a certain way because of family or tradition? Write in the comments. Do you think doubt can be the beginning of real faith? The day everything went wrong. The day my life ended began like any other. There was nothing prophetic about the morning. No warning dreams, no strange feelings, just routine. I kissed Miriam on the forehead, reminded my children to finish their homework, and stepped into the familiar noise of Jerusalem waking up. I remember thinking about deadlines. I was overseeing a road expansion project just outside the city, a complex site with heavy machinery, uneven terrain, and constant pressure to move faster. Speed mattered more than caution, at least to the people above me. As I drove, the radio spoke of conflict, politics, threats. I turned it off. The noise felt unbearable. Something in me longed for silence. At the site, everything looked normal. Too normal. Workers moved steel beams into place. Excavators growled. Dust filled the air. I reviewed plans, checked measurements, corrected a mistake that could have cost thousands. I was focused, present, in control. Then someone shouted. I turned just as a massive steel support shifted, not slowly, not dramatically, but suddenly, violently. A chain snapped, metal screamed against metal. There was no time to run. The beam came down with terrifying force. I felt a crushing impact against my chest, a sensation like my body folding inward. The air exploded out of my lungs. Pain surged, sharp, overwhelming, absolute. I hit the ground hard, the world spinning into fragments of sound and color. People were screaming, or maybe that was me. I remember trying to breathe and realizing I couldn't. Every attempt felt like drowning on dry land. Panic rose fast, animal and raw. This isn't how it's supposed to end, I thought. My vision narrowed. Faces hovered above me, blurred and frantic. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Another voice kept saying my name over and over, as if repetition could anchor me to life. But something was slipping. The pain began to fade, not because it stopped, but because I was retreating from it. The noise softened. The world dimmed. Then came the strangest moment of all. A thought, calm, clear, undeniable, passed through my mind. I am dying. There was no drama in it, no fear, just recognition. My last physical sensation was an immense pressure in my chest, followed by release, like something tearing free. And then, silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but of transition. The kind of silence that feels intentional. The world I knew vanished. Pause for a moment. Have you ever realized how fragile life truly is? How quickly everything can change? Write in the comments. What would be your last thought if today were your last day? The moment of death. Death was not what I expected. There was no tunnel at first. No judgment. No darkness swallowing me whole. What I felt was separation. One moment, I was pain. The next, I was awareness. I realized I was no longer inside my body. Not because someone told me, but because the pain was gone. Completely gone. The crushing weight in my chest had vanished as if it had never existed. I felt light. Not metaphorically, literally weightless. Then I saw my body. It was lying on the ground, twisted in a way that made me uncomfortable to look at. Blood stained my shirt. My face was pale, still, too still. People surrounded it, moving frantically, shouting instructions, pressing hands against wounds. And yet, none of it felt like me. I hovered above the scene, calm beyond explanation. I could see everything clearly, sharper than my physical vision had ever been. Colors were vivid. Sounds were precise yet distant, as if filtered through meaning rather than air. I watched a paramedic check for a pulse. I watched him look up and shake his head. That's when I understood. My heart had stopped. Strangely, I didn't feel fear. What I felt was clarity. Thoughts flowed effortlessly. I didn't think in sentences, I knew. Time no longer felt linear. Everything existed at once. The past, the present, the weight of my entire life condensed into a single awareness. I thought of Miriam, of my children, of unfinished conversations and unsaid truths. But even those thoughts carried no regret, only understanding. Then something deeper happened. The world below me began to fade, not into darkness, but into irrelevance, like a scene that no longer required my attention. I felt myself being drawn, gently, deliberately, away from the physical realm. There was no force, no fear, only invitation. As I moved, a profound peace wrapped around me. It wasn't emotional comfort. It was total safety. The kind of peace that makes fear impossible, because fear simply doesn't exist there. I realized something shocking. I was more alive now than I had ever been. My senses expanded beyond anything I had known. I could perceive without eyes, hear without ears, understand without language. Every question I had ever wrestled with seemed suddenly small, not because they were meaningless, but because answers were closer than I had imagined. Then, ahead of me, I sensed something else. A presence. Not yet visible, but unmistakable. Powerful. Conscious. A presence that felt older than time and closer than breath. And I knew, with a certainty deeper than belief, that I was not alone. Let me ask you something. Do you believe consciousness ends with the body, or continues beyond it? Write in the comments. What do you think happens in the moment of death? Leaving the body. As I moved farther from my body, the distance was not measured in meters or space. It was measured in attachment. Everything that once defined me began to loosen its grip. My name, my profession, my achievements, my failures, none of them disappeared, but they no longer weighed anything. I understood them without being bound by them, It felt like waking up from a dream and realizing that what once felt urgent was only temporary. I became aware that I was traveling, not drifting aimlessly, but being guided. There was direction without movement, motion without speed. I wasn't floating through space. I was transitioning through states of existence. Each moment felt intentional, precise, deeply ordered, and the peace, it was overwhelming. On Earth, peace is fragile. It depends on circumstances. It can be broken by news, loss, fear. But this peace was structural. It was woven into the very fabric of where I was. Fear could not survive there. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by fear. Fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of asking forbidden questions. And now, fear felt like a distant memory, something I once carried but no longer needed. I sensed other presences around me, not bodies, not faces, consciousness. A vast awareness, interconnected, harmonious. There was no judgment in them, no curiosity, no intrusion, only recognition, as if they knew me completely and loved me anyway. I tried to speak, but communication didn't happen through words. It happened through understanding. When I had a question, the answer arrived fully formed, without explanation. I understood that my life had meaning, every moment, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones. Then I became aware of something else, something ahead. Light. Not a light that illuminates objects, but a light that contains knowledge. It wasn't blinding, it was inviting, alive. The closer I drew, the more I felt seen, not observed, but known. And instead of wanting to hide, I felt a deep longing to move closer. I thought of everything I had believed about God, distant, silent, hidden behind rituals and laws. And I realized how small my understanding had been. This presence was not distant. It was intimate. It knew my doubts. It knew my loyalty. It knew my resistance. And still, it welcomed me. As I approached the light, I felt something I had never experienced before. Unconditional love. Not sentimental, not emotional, but absolute. A love that didn't ask me to prove anything. A love that existed simply because I existed. Then, from within that light, the presence revealed itself. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew began to unravel. Pause and reflect. Have you ever felt a peace so deep that fear had no place in it? Write in the comments, what do you think true peace feels like? The light that changed everything. The light was not something I approached. It was something that received me. As I moved closer, I realized the light had depth, layers upon layers of meaning, presence, and intelligence. It wasn't like sunlight or fire or anything created. It felt alive, a living reality that existed before time itself. The closer I came, the more I felt exposed, not physically, but spiritually. Every thought I had ever hidden, every motive I had disguised, every doubt I had buried beneath tradition and routine. Nothing was concealed, and yet, I felt no shame. On Earth, exposure brings fear. We hide because we expect rejection. But here, being fully known brought only relief. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to explain my choices or justify my beliefs. The light already understood. I sensed that this light had witnessed my entire life, not as a judge watching from afar, but as a presence walking beside me, even when I didn't know it was there. Memories began to surface, not as images, but as truths. Moments I had forgotten. Moments I had misunderstood. I saw myself as a child, asking questions no one could answer. I saw my loyalty to my people, my faithfulness to tradition. I saw my resistance, not born of pride, but of fear of betrayal. And the light responded not with correction, but with compassion. I felt something then that shook me deeply. I had been loved even in my misunderstanding. Suddenly the light intensified, not brighter but clearer, and from within it a form began to emerge. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My mind searched for categories, labels, explanations, and found none that fit. Then recognition struck me like a wave. Not recognition of a face from history, but recognition of a presence my soul already knew. He stood before me, not suspended, not distant, but near, approachable, real. His eyes held a depth that terrified and comforted me at the same time. They carried authority without dominance, holiness without coldness. When he looked at me, it felt as though eternity itself paused. I knew who he was, and that knowledge shattered everything I thought I understood. Jesus. The name echoed through me, not as a word, but as truth. My first reaction was shock, not anger, not denial, but disbelief. This cannot be, I thought. I am a Jewish man. I have kept the faith of my fathers. Before I could form another thought, understanding flowed into me, not spoken, not argued, revealed. I understood that Jesus was not a rejection of my faith, but its fulfillment, not the abandonment of the God of Israel, but his visible expression. Every prophecy I had read without clarity suddenly aligned. Every unanswered question found its place. The pieces of history, suffering, covenant, and redemption converged into a single, undeniable reality. He did not accuse me. He did not ask why I had doubted. Instead, his presence communicated one overwhelming truth. I have always known you. I fell, not physically, but inwardly. All resistance dissolved. All walls collapsed. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to argue, only surrender. And in that surrender, something extraordinary happened. I felt love, not conditional love, not religious love, but perfect love. Love that carried truth without cruelty, correction without condemnation. I understood that he had walked with my people through exile, persecution, and suffering, that he had not abandoned Israel, that history had not unfolded by accident. Tears, if such a thing exists beyond the body, flowed through me, not from sorrow, but from release. Then, he communicated something that shifted the atmosphere entirely. The warmth remained, the love remained, but urgency entered the light. I sensed that what I was experiencing was not only for me. Something was coming, something close, something that would shake the world. And then, without words, Jesus directed my awareness forward, beyond myself, beyond my life, toward a specific moment in time. January 2026. The light around us seemed to pulse with significance. And I knew. This was only the beginning. Pause here and reflect deeply. What would it do to your beliefs if everything you thought you knew suddenly made sense? Write in the comments, do you believe truth can be bigger than religion? Meeting Jesus. The truth I never expected. Standing before Jesus, I realized how inadequate human language is to describe what I experienced. He was not fragile, not distant, not passive. There was strength in him, quiet, immovable strength. Authority that didn't need to assert itself, power restrained by love. I expected questions. I expected judgment. I expected to be confronted with everything I had gotten wrong. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as knowing. Not knowing facts, knowing me. Every version of me existed in his gaze at once. The child repeating prayers by memory, the man carrying doubt in silence, the father trying to be strong while feeling incomplete. Nothing was hidden. And yet, nothing was rejected. I tried to speak. The moment I formed a question, he responded, not with words, but with direct understanding. His communication bypassed language entirely. Truth entered me whole, without distortion. I understood that he was not foreign to Judaism. He was not a betrayal of Israel. He was not an interruption in God's plan. He was the continuation. The covenant was not broken. It was fulfilled. I saw the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel. their words lighting up with clarity I had never perceived before. Passages I had read dozens of times suddenly revealed layers hidden beneath tradition and time. I understood that Jesus did not come to erase the law, but to complete its purpose. This realization didn't feel like losing my identity. It felt like finding it. Then the atmosphere shifted. The love remained constant, but something new emerged. Gravity, purpose, urgency. Jesus turned my attention outward. I was shown the world, not as maps or borders, but as states of the human heart. Fear, confusion, pride, despair, nations trembling under unseen pressure, people distracted yet deeply unsettled. I felt it immediately. The world was approaching a threshold. Then Jesus made something unmistakably clear. Time is accelerating. What once unfolded over decades would now happen in months. What humanity ignored for years would suddenly demand attention. Systems people trusted would begin to fail. Not all at once, but enough to expose how fragile they truly were. I sensed sorrow in him, not anger. Humanity was not being punished. Humanity was being warned. Then my focus was drawn to a specific moment. Not symbolic, not distant, specific. January 2026. The moment this date was revealed, the space around us seemed to tighten, as if creation itself acknowledged its importance. I understood that this was not the end, but the beginning of a sequence. Jesus impressed upon me that many would say, everything is normal, but beneath the surface, everything would already be shifting. Then he revealed why this mattered. Because January 2026 would mark the start of 5 converging events. Events that would not only affect governments or economies, but the spiritual condition of humanity. I wasn't shown details yet, only the weight of what was coming. The message was clear. People would be forced to choose between comfort and truth, between fear and faith, between control and surrender. I felt overwhelmed. Not by fear, but by responsibility. Why show me this? I asked, or rather, I intended the question. The answer came immediately. Because you will tell them. I felt unqualified. I was not a preacher, not a scholar, not a Christian, not even certain how my own people would respond. Jesus knew this and addressed it without words. It was precisely because I had not expected him that my testimony would matter. Then he showed me something painful. I saw many dismissing the warnings, mocking, scrolling past, calling it exaggeration or manipulation. Others would feel the truth stir inside them, but remain silent out of fear of standing out. And I felt his grief, not because people would reject him, but because they would reject the chance to prepare. Still, hope remained. I was shown individuals, ordinary people, who would hear the message and awaken. Families who would return to prayer. Hearts that would soften. Lives that would change direction before it was too late. Then Jesus made one final thing unmistakably clear. This message was not about fear. It was about mercy. The warning was an invitation to wake up. Pause and reflect deeply. If you knew the world was about to change, would you want to be warned or stay comfortable? Write in the comments. Do you believe God still warns humanity today? The first warning, January 2026, begins. When Jesus revealed January 2026, it was not presented as a random date or a symbolic marker. It was fixed, intentional, chosen. I felt the weight of it immediately. The kind of weight that presses not on the body, but on the soul. This was not a prediction meant to satisfy curiosity. It was a warning meant to provoke awakening. Jesus directed my awareness forward in time. I did not see calendars or numbers. I felt the shift. January 2026 would arrive quietly. No sirens, no global announcement, no single catastrophic event that would instantly convince everyone something had changed. On the surface, life would appear normal. People working, shopping, planning vacations, arguing about politics. But beneath that surface, Something fundamental would begin to fracture. Jesus made me understand that humanity had grown dangerously confident in its systems. People trusted economies more than God, technology more than wisdom, information more than truth. January 2026 would mark the moment when these false foundations would begin to expose their weakness. The first warning was not destruction. It was instability. I was shown financial structures trembling, not collapsing overnight, but shaking enough to create fear. Markets reacting to unseen pressures, governments scrambling to reassure populations while privately realizing they were losing control. But this was only one layer. I was also shown confusion, widespread confusion, not simply misinformation, but an inability to discern what was real. Truth and lies blending together until people no longer trusted anything except what comforted them. Jesus communicated something chilling. When truth becomes uncomfortable, many will choose illusion. January 2026 would intensify this divide. Some would cling desperately to distractions. Entertainment would grow louder. Arguments would grow angrier. People would sense something was wrong but refuse to name it. Others, however, would feel a deep stirring, an unease they could not explain. Sleep would be restless. Hearts would feel heavy without reason. A quiet voice would whisper, "Pay attention." That voice, I understood, would be mercy. Then I was shown something that troubled me deeply. Spiritual hunger would increase, but not always toward God. Many would seek answers in control, ideology, movements, and even false spirituality. Anything that promised certainty without surrender. Anything that offered power without humility. Jesus made it clear, deception would not arrive wearing darkness. It would arrive wearing solutions. I felt sorrow in him as he revealed this. Not everyone who felt the shift would respond wisely. January 2026 would begin a sorting, not of nations, but of hearts. Those anchored in humility would seek God more deeply. Those anchored in pride would double down on themselves. I was shown families divided, not by hatred, but by worldview. Conversations that once felt harmless would suddenly feel tense. Faith would no longer be a private matter. Silence would feel heavier than disagreement. Then Jesus impressed something vital upon me. This was not punishment. It was exposure. Exposure of what people truly trusted. I saw that prayer would become difficult for many, not because God was distant, but because distraction had trained hearts to be restless. Silence would feel unbearable. Reflection would feel threatening. And yet, for those who pushed past discomfort, something extraordinary would happen. God would feel closer than ever. January 2026 would awaken a remnant, people who were tired of pretending, tired of shallow answers, tired of living without meaning. They would return to prayer not out of tradition, but desperation. And God would answer, not always by changing circumstances, but by changing hearts. Jesus showed me that miracles would still occur, but they would not look like spectacle. They would look like repentance, reconciliation, courage, peace in the middle of uncertainty. Then he revealed why this first warning mattered so much, because it was only the beginning. The instability of January 2026 was meant to prepare humanity for what would follow. Those who ignored the warning would be shaken later. Those who listened would be strengthened. I felt the urgency intensify. This message was not for the future only. It was for now. Because preparation is not something you do once the storm begins. Preparation happens when the sky still looks clear. Reflect honestly. If life around you started feeling unstable, where would you turn for security? Write in the comments, what do you truly trust when everything else feels uncertain? The 5 shocking events revealed. When Jesus began to reveal the 5 events, the atmosphere around us changed completely. The peace remained, but it was now charged with intensity, like the stillness before a powerful storm. I understood immediately that these were not random disasters or isolated crises. They were connected, unfolding in sequence, each one amplifying the next. Jesus made it clear. These events would not all happen in January 2026, but January would activate them. What followed shook me deeply. The first event, a global shaking of trust. I was shown institutions people relied on, governments, financial systems, medical authorities, media, not collapsing entirely, but losing credibility. Scandals would surface, contradictions would be exposed, promises would fail. People would begin asking, who is telling the truth? Jesus revealed that this loss of trust would be more damaging than economic loss. Because when trust disappears, fear rushes in to take its place. This event would divide societies, not by class or race, but by belief in reality itself. Some would demand absolute control to feel safe. Others would reject all authority entirely. Both reactions, Jesus showed me, would miss the deeper issue. Humanity had replaced God with systems, and January 2026 would expose that mistake. The second event, accelerated moral confusion. The second event disturbed me even more. Right and wrong would become increasingly subjective. What was once considered obvious would be debated. What was once protected would be redefined. Jesus showed me people defending actions they once knew were harmful, not out of ignorance, but out of pride. Truth would feel offensive. Conviction would be labeled hatred. Wisdom would be dismissed as weakness. I felt deep sorrow as I saw young people especially struggling, not because they were evil, but because they were overwhelmed by conflicting messages. Jesus communicated something painful. When truth is removed, people do not become free. They become lost. This confusion would create anxiety, depression, and anger on a massive scale. Many would feel empty without understanding why. The third event, a sudden rise of false unity. Then I was shown something deceptive, a movement, or rather multiple movements, promising unity, peace, and stability. They would speak the language of compassion and progress, but beneath the surface, they demanded conformity. Jesus revealed that many would embrace these movements not because they believed in them, but because they were tired of chaos. Peace would be offered, at the cost of truth. Those who questioned would be pressured into silence, not violently at first, socially, economically, digitally. I understood then. This was not about politics. It was about allegiance. The fourth event, a spiritual awakening and a spiritual deception. This event was the most complex. At the same time darkness intensified, spiritual hunger would explode. Prayer would increase. People would search for God. Churches, synagogues, and spiritual spaces would fill, but not all awakenings would be genuine. Jesus showed me counterfeit spirituality, experiences without repentance, power without humility, light without truth. Signs and wonders would be claimed, visions would be shared, but discernment would be rare. Still, true awakening would also occur, quiet, humble, transformational. Lives would be changed not by spectacle, but by surrender. The separation between true and false faith would become unmistakable. The fifth event, a choice no one can avoid. Finally, Jesus showed me the most sobering truth of all. There would come a point, after these events had unfolded, when neutrality would no longer be possible. People would be forced to choose comfort or conviction, acceptance or obedience, control or trust in God. Not choosing would itself become a choice. Jesus impressed this upon me with incredible gravity. Many believe they have time. They do not. This was not said in anger, but in grief. I felt the weight of responsibility crushing me. How will they know? I wondered. The answer was simple and terrifying. They will know if you tell them. I understood then why I had been shown all this. Not to frighten people, not to predict dates, but to call hearts back to God before fear becomes their God. January 2026 was not the end. It was the alarm. Let me ask you honestly, If everything familiar began to shift, what would guide your decisions? Write in the comments. Which of these 5 events do you feel is already beginning? Tell them the time is short. When Jesus spoke those words, they did not sound like a threat. They sounded like grief, restrained by love. Tell them the time is short. The meaning entered me all at once. This was not about dates on a calendar alone. It was about opportunity. About a narrowing window in which hearts could still change direction without being forced by fear. I felt the urgency immediately. Not frantic urgency, but deliberate urgency. The kind that comes when something precious is at risk of being lost. I sensed Jesus drawing my attention back to my life on earth, to my family, my community, the ordinary rhythm I had taken for granted. I understood that everything I had seen was not meant to remain in heaven. It was meant to be carried back. A question formed within me, heavy and honest. Why me? I was not a rabbi, not a pastor, not a theologian. I was a Jewish engineer with doubts, responsibilities, and a quiet life. The answer came gently but firmly. Because I was ordinary, because my testimony would not come from ambition or position, it would come from interruption, from transformation, from surprise. Jesus impressed upon me that many would dismiss warnings from those they already disagreed with. But they would hesitate when the messenger did not fit the expected narrative. A Jewish man, raised in tradition, uninterested in conversion, unprepared for what he encountered. That contradiction would make people listen, even if only for a moment. Then I was shown something deeply personal. I saw myself trying to speak, and hesitating. I saw fear rise in me, fear of rejection, fear of misunderstanding, fear of being labeled or dismissed. I saw my own people questioning my sanity, friends avoiding uncomfortable conversations. And Jesus acknowledged that fear. He did not minimize it. He showed me that obedience would not make my life easier, but it would make it meaningful. Then he showed me something else. Silence. I saw what would happen if I chose silence instead of obedience. It wasn't punishment. It was loss, missed moments, unspoken warnings. People unprepared not because God hadn't spoken, but because his messenger had stayed quiet. That realization hurt more than any rejection could. Jesus made it clear, the message did not require perfection. It required honesty. I didn't need to explain everything. I didn't need to convince everyone. I needed only to testify, to tell what I had seen, what I had heard, and what had changed me. Then he showed me the hearts of those who would hear. Some would mock, some would scroll past, some would feel uncomfortable and turn away. But others would feel something stir deep inside them. A recognition they couldn't explain, a reminder they had been ignoring. Those moments mattered, because even a seed planted in discomfort can grow later. Jesus impressed upon me that the world did not need louder arguments. It needed clear warnings spoken with love. He showed me that fear-driven messages would harden hearts, but truth spoken without manipulation could still reach people before events forced them to listen. Then came a moment that shook me profoundly. Jesus allowed me to feel his heart. The sorrow he carried was not about rejection. It was about delay. People waiting too long to forgive, too long to repent, too long to pray, too long to return. He showed me that many believed they would change later, when things became clearer, calmer, more convenient. But clarity would come through shaking, and convenience would disappear. That is why the warning had to come before January 2026. Before instability trained hearts to react instead of reflect. Before fear replaced humility. Then Jesus told me something I will never forget. Those who prepare in quiet will stand in noise. Preparation, I understood, was not stockpiling supplies or predicting headlines. It was aligning the heart, returning to prayer, letting go of pride, choosing truth even when it costs comfort. Jesus did not ask me to create fear. He asked me to awaken conscience. The final instruction was simple and overwhelming. Tell them I am near. Tell them I have not abandoned them. Tell them this is mercy. And with that, I felt something change. The space around us began to shift again. The encounter was not ending because it was incomplete. It was ending because my assignment was about to begin. Pause and reflect honestly. If you felt called to warn others, would fear stop you or obedience move you? Write in the comments, what would keep you silent and what would make you speak? Returning to the body. I did not want to leave. That was my first thought when I felt the shift begin. The presence of Jesus was still before me, steady, compassionate, unchanging, but the environment around us started to recede, like a tide pulling back from shore. The peace remained, yet something unfamiliar entered it. Resistance. Not resistance from him, resistance from me. For the first time since leaving my body, I felt something like reluctance. The thought of returning to pain, limitation, misunderstanding, and gravity felt unbearable. Compared to the clarity I now possessed, life on earth seemed unbearably small. I wanted to stay. Without words, Jesus acknowledged this desire. And without judgment, he made something clear. My time there was complete. There was still work to be done, not there, but here. I felt myself being pulled backward, not violently, but irresistibly. The light dimmed, not in intensity, but in proximity. The awareness that had expanded so effortlessly now began to compress. And then I felt it. Weight, density, restriction. The return was far more difficult than the leaving. Sound slammed into me first, sharp, chaotic, intrusive, beeping. Voices overlapping, urgency, confusion, then pain, raw, burning pain that seized my chest and flooded my limbs. I gasped violently. Air tore into my lungs like fire. My body convulsed as consciousness slammed back into flesh. I heard someone shout, "He's back! We've got him!" My eyes opened, but everything was blurred and distorted. Light stabbed painfully. Hands restrained me gently but firmly. I tried to speak, to tell them what I had seen, but my throat could only manage broken sounds. I had returned, but nothing felt the same. The next days passed in fragments. Hospital lights, machines, doctors explaining injuries, crushed ribs, internal bleeding, trauma that should have killed me. I heard words like unlikely, miracle, and unexplainable. But no explanation could touch what I carried inside me. My body healed slowly, painfully. Every breath reminded me of how fragile flesh truly is. But the greater struggle was not physical. It was integration. I was awake at night, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by contrast. The hospital room felt unbearably loud, unbearably confined. The world moved too slowly, spoke too shallowly. And yet, I was grateful. Miriam barely left my side. She held my hand in silence, tears often streaming without explanation. My children looked at me with a mixture of relief and confusion, as if sensing that their father had returned. Different. They were right. I tried to pray the way I used to, but I couldn't. Not because I had lost faith, because faith had become relational. Prayer was no longer ritual or repetition. It was awareness, reverence, listening. And listening, I realized, came with a cost. I knew things now. Not headlines, not dates, but direction. January 2026 echoed constantly in my mind. Not as fear, but as urgency. I felt time differently, as if days carried weight and delay felt dangerous. I struggled with silence. Every time someone spoke casually about the future, plans, ambitions, assumptions, I felt a tightening in my chest. They didn't know, and yet, how could I tell them? Who would believe me? A Jewish man claiming to have met Jesus. I wrestled deeply with fear. Fear of losing credibility, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected by my own people. I prayed, not for clarity, but for courage, and slowly, quietly, courage came, not as confidence, as obedience. I began speaking carefully at first, not declarations, just honesty. I told close friends that something had happened to me, that death was not the end, that God was closer than we imagined. Some listened politely, some avoided the conversation, some grew uncomfortable. But then, something unexpected happened. A few leaned in. They asked questions, not arguments, questions. And I felt it again. The quiet stirring Jesus had shown me. Seeds landing where they were meant to land. I understood then. I was not responsible for results, only for faithfulness. The message did not need embellishment, it needed truth. The more I resisted urgency, the heavier it became. Silence began to feel like disobedience. I remembered the warning I had been given, that silence itself carried consequence. And so I made a decision. I would speak, even if my voice shook, even if my words were imperfect, even if it cost me comfort, because what I had seen was not meant to remain hidden. The world was approaching a threshold, and mercy had spoken before the storm. Pause and reflect. If you returned from death knowing time was short, how would it change the way you live? Write in the comments, do you think truth becomes harder or more urgent after suffering? A life that can no longer be silent. I did not return to life to be comfortable. That truth became clear to me long before my body fully healed. What I carried back from death was not fear, not superiority, not secret knowledge meant to elevate me above others. What I carried was responsibility, the quiet, heavy kind that doesn't shout, but never lets you rest. I tried at first to live normally. I returned to work. I smiled at neighbors. I sat at family dinners and listened to conversations about the future, careers, plans, holidays, retirement. On the outside, I was the same Eliyahu ben Ami. On the inside, everything had changed. Time no longer felt endless. Words no longer felt neutral. Silence no longer felt harmless. I had seen what waits beyond this life. And more importantly, I had seen how close heaven still is. God was not distant. He was not absent. He was patient. But patience, I learned, is not the same as delay. January 2026 was no longer a concept to me. It was a boundary. Not a deadline for destruction, but a threshold for decision. I understood now that humanity often waits for crisis to seek truth. But mercy always speaks before the collapse, not after. That is why warnings feel uncomfortable. They interrupt illusions. I also understood something painful. Not everyone wants to be awakened. Some prefer certainty over truth. Some prefer comfort over conviction. Some prefer noise over reflection. And that is their choice. But I was not given the luxury of choosing silence. The more I prayed, the clearer it became. My mission was not to convince everyone, but to witness honestly. To say, without exaggeration or manipulation, this is what I saw. This is what changed me. This is why time matters. I was shown that transformation rarely comes through arguments. It comes through recognition. Someone hears a story, and something inside them stirs. A memory of God they ignored, a question they buried, a hunger they tried to drown with distraction. Those moments matter more than applause or agreement. I also learned that urgency does not mean panic. Urgency means alignment. It means asking yourself uncomfortable questions before circumstances force you to ask them. Questions like, what do I truly trust? If everything I rely on shakes, what remains? Am I living prepared or merely distracted? If today were my last ordinary day, would I be at peace? Jesus did not show me the future to create fear. He showed it to offer mercy. Because mercy warns. Mercy interrupts. Mercy calls people back before loss becomes their teacher. I was shown that many believe faith is something you turn to when life falls apart. But real faith is built before the shaking, quietly, humbly, without spectators. Prayer before panic, repentance before exposure, surrender before pressure. That is preparation. January 2026 will not ask permission to arrive. The question is not whether the world will change. It already is. The real question is, will you be awake when it does? I speak now not as a preacher, not as a prophet, not as someone seeking followers. I speak as a man who died and was sent back, a Jewish man who never expected to meet Jesus and was undone by truth that did not destroy his faith, but completed it. I know some will doubt this. That is expected. But I also know, with absolute certainty, that some of you reading this feel something stirring right now. Not fear, recognition. If that is you, do not ignore it. Stillness is becoming rare. Truth is becoming costly. Time is becoming precious. Do not wait for January 2026 to ask eternal questions. Do not wait for loss to teach you what surrender could have taught gently. Do not assume there will always be later. Later is not guaranteed. What is guaranteed is this: God is near. Mercy is speaking. And silence is no longer neutral. If this testimony has stirred something in you, write in the comments. What part of this story affected you the most? Do you feel the world is approaching a turning point? If you believe God is calling people to wake up, what do you think He is saying to you? Your comment matters more than you think, not for algorithms, but because speaking truth out loud is often the first step toward transformation. And if you believe messages like this are important, if you believe people need warnings spoken with love, not fear, then subscribe to this channel. Not for entertainment, but for awareness, for urgency, for truth spoken before the storm. Share this with someone you care about, not to scare them, but to give them a chance to prepare in peace rather than panic. Because when everything begins to change, those who listened early will stand differently when the noise begins. And remember this: January 2026 is not the end. It is the moment when pretending becomes impossible. Choose wisely. Choose humbly. Choose now. When silence is no longer an option. I never imagined that surviving death would be harder than dying. For a long time after my return, I thought the greatest challenge would be explaining what I saw. I was wrong. The real challenge was deciding what to do with it. Because once you have seen beyond this world, once you have touched a reality more solid than the one we call life, neutrality becomes impossible. You don't simply go back to normal. You don't unsee truth. You don't forget urgency. And you certainly don't escape responsibility. I want you to understand something clearly. I am not sharing this story because I enjoy attention. In fact, there are days when I wish I had never been shown what I was shown. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because truth carries weight, and weight changes the way you walk. Every day since my return, I have lived with a heightened awareness of time. Not clocks, not schedules, meaning. Moments feel heavier now. Conversations feel more fragile. Choices feel eternal in a way they never did before. I see how easily people postpone what matters most. I'll forgive later. I'll pray when things calm down. I'll change when life slows. I'll think about God when I'm older. But what I learned beyond this life is devastatingly simple. Later is not promised. Not because God is cruel, but because life is fragile. We plan as if tomorrow is guaranteed, yet we live in a world where everything can change in a single breath. A phone call, a diagnosis, an accident, a collapse no one predicted. And still, we delay. That delay is not neutral. It shapes us. I was shown that humanity is approaching a season where delay will become costly, not because God is impatient, but because the world itself is becoming unstable. Systems we trust are weakening. Truth is being diluted. Noise is replacing wisdom. January 2026 is not a magical date. It is a marker, a point where hidden fractures become visible. You may already feel it, a subtle tension in the air, a sense that something is off, an unease that distractions no longer fully silence. Many feel it and suppress it. Others feel it and panic. But a few feel it and listen. Those are the ones this message is for. I was not shown the future to terrify people. I was shown the future to interrupt complacency, because complacency is far more dangerous than fear. Fear can drive people to prayer. Complacency drives people to sleep, and sleep is comfortable until the shaking begins. What I saw was not a God eager to punish, but a God desperate to prepare his children before pressure removes their ability to choose freely. There is a difference between choosing faith in peace and choosing it under threat. One is surrender, the other is survival. God desires the first. That is why warnings come early. That is why truth often feels inconvenient. That is why mercy speaks before collapse. I want to speak directly to you now, not as a narrator, not as a character in a story, but as a man who stood outside his body and realized how small excuses look from eternity. If you feel something stirring inside you while hearing this, do not dismiss it. That stirring is not fear. It is recognition. It is the soul remembering something the mind has tried to ignore. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to change everything overnight. But you do need to stop pretending that time is endless. Ask yourself honestly, if everything familiar were shaken, what would remain in me? If silence were removed, what truth would I be forced to face? If today were my last ordinary day, would I be ready? Not religiously, but relationally. Because faith is not about performance. It is about alignment. Alignment of heart with truth. Alignment of life with purpose. Alignment of will with humility. One of the most painful things I learned after returning is this. Many people confuse faith with identity. They say, I was raised this way, or this is my culture, or this is what my family believes. But eternity does not ask where you were raised. It asks who you trusted. And trust is not inherited. It is chosen. Jesus did not reveal himself to me to erase my past. He revealed himself to complete it. To show me that God's story is larger than categories, larger than labels, larger than human divisions. Truth does not destroy sincere faith. It fulfills it. And yet, I know some of you listening are uncomfortable right now. That discomfort is important. Truth often feels disruptive before it feels liberating. Do not rush to silence it. Sit with it. Let it ask you questions, because the world ahead will reward conformity, but eternity rewards conviction. I was shown that many will trade truth for acceptance in the coming years, not because they are evil, but because they are tired. Tired of conflict, tired of uncertainty, tired of standing alone. But standing alone is sometimes the cost of standing rightly. I do not say this to glorify isolation. I say this to prepare you. January 2026 will not demand perfection. It will demand clarity. Clarity about what you believe. Clarity about what you obey. Clarity about what you refuse to compromise. Those who avoid these questions now will be forced to answer them later, under pressure. Those who face them now will carry peace later, even in chaos. That is mercy. I know some will say, people have always said the world is ending. This is true. But this message is not about the end of the world. It is about the end of pretending. Pretending that truth is relative. Pretending that God is distant. Pretending that comfort is safety. The shaking that is coming will not destroy everything, but it will reveal everything. And revelation is uncomfortable only for those who are unprepared. I am not asking you to fear January 2026. I am asking you to respect it, as a moment to wake up, as a season to realign, as a reminder that life is fragile and eternity is real. If you are listening to this and thinking, I need to change something, start small, but start now. Pray honestly, not perfectly. Forgive deliberately, not emotionally. Seek truth humbly, not defensively. And most importantly, stop delaying obedience. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. I did not come back to life to be silent. And you did not hear this by accident. If this message reached you, it is because you were meant to hear it, not to panic, but to prepare. So I ask you now directly, what is God asking you to stop ignoring? What truth have you postponed because it was inconvenient? If the world changes faster than you expect, will your foundation hold? Write your answer in the comments. Not because comments matter, but because speaking truth out loud breaks denial. And if you believe messages like this are important, if you believe the world needs warnings spoken with love instead of manipulation, then subscribe to this channel. Not for entertainment, not for theories, but for clarity in confusing times. Share this message with someone you care about, not to frighten them, but to give them time, because time is still a gift. But gifts expire when they are ignored. January 2026 is not the end. It is the moment when excuses grow quiet and decisions grow loud. Do not wait for fear to teach you what mercy is offering now. Choose awareness, choose humility, choose truth, and choose it before the shaking forces your hand. Silence is no longer neutral, and neither is delay.